Imagine you have a big work presentation tomorrow. Your stomach churns, palms sweat, and mind races with all the things that could go wrong. You're filled with dread, and yet the presentation hasn't even happened. It's fascinating, isn't it, how we humans often subject ourselves to a double dose of suffering. Once in anticipation of an event, and then when the event actually takes place. This anticipatory anxiety, this imaginary suffering, is a common phenomenon that most of us can relate to. The good news, it's not inevitable. The ancient Stoics, with their practical wisdom, offer a way out. They believed in the power of the mind to control our reactions and emotions. As the Stoic philosopher Seneca once said, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. But what if we told you that much of this suffering happens only in your mind, and there's a way to control it? Let's turn to the wisdom of the ancient Stoics, specifically a quote from Seneca, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." At first glance, this quote may seem abstract, but it's actually quite relatable. It's about that gnawing feeling of dread we sometimes get when we're facing a challenging situation. It's about the sleepless nights before a big presentation, the worry about an upcoming medical test, or the anxiety over a difficult conversation. What Seneca is suggesting is that our fear and anxiety about these future events, these things that haven't happened yet, can cause us more suffering than the events themselves. In other words, we're often more distressed by what we imagine could go wrong than by what actually happens. So how does this tie into Stoicism? Well, Stoicism is a philosophy that dates back to ancient Greece and Rome, and one of its key principles is the idea of control. Stoics believe that while we can't always control what happens to us, we can control how we react to it. We can't prevent the storm, but we can learn to dance in the rain, so to speak. Stoicism encourages us to focus on what's in our control, and that includes our thoughts and reactions. When we're facing a potentially stressful situation, we can choose to let our fears run wild, imagining all the things that could go wrong. Or we can choose to focus on the present moment, on what we can do right now to prepare and respond. Stoicism isn't about being emotionless or ignoring our feelings, quite the contrary. It's about recognizing our emotions, understanding where they're coming from, and then choosing how we want to respond. Instead of being swept away by our fears and worries, we can learn to navigate them, to use them as tools for growth and self-improvement. So we see that Stoicism invites us to focus on what's in our control. And that includes our thoughts and reactions. It's a reminder that while we can't always change our circumstances, we can change how we perceive and respond to them. But why does our mind do this? Why does it conjure up these terrifying scenarios? It's a fascinating query that takes us deep into the realm of psychology. The human mind is essentially a survival machine. It's been fine-tuned over millions of years to detect potential threats and prepare us for danger. This inherent mechanism, while useful in primal times, can often lead us astray in today's world. Often our minds get stuck in a loop of negative forecasting, where we visualize the worst possible outcomes. Think of it as our mind's way of rehearsing for disaster, a disaster that, more often than not, never comes. This tendency to overestimate negative outcomes is known as catastrophizing. Let's take some common scenarios. Many of us dread public speaking. We imagine ourselves forgetting the speech, fumbling with words, or facing a hostile audience, yet when the actual event unfolds, it's rarely as horrifying as we imagined. Or consider awaiting medical test results. Our mind races to the worst diagnoses, yet most times the results are far less severe. This habit of catastrophizing, of suffering in our imagination, is deeply ingrained in our psyche. It's a byproduct of our evolutionary instinct to prepare for the worst. But in the modern world, this instinct often does us more harm than good. It causes unnecessary anxiety, stress, and even physical symptoms like insomnia and heart palpitations. In essence, we're not just suffering from the events in our lives, but from the imaginary scenarios we create in our minds. We often fear events that haven't happened yet and may never happen at all. We're living in a future that exists only in our imagination, and this imagined future is causing us real suffering in the present. It seems that our minds are wired to anticipate the worst, but Stoicism gives us the tools to rewire this tendency. So let's delve into how we can use Stoic philosophy to combat this imaginary suffering and reclaim control over our minds. So what happens when we let our imaginations run wild with worry? Well, for starters, it can have a profound impact on our personal happiness. When we're consumed by worry, we become prisoners of our own minds. We're no longer living in the present moment, but in a future filled with imagined disasters. This constant state of stress and anxiety can lead to a cascade of negative emotions, robbing us of the joy and contentment that come with simply being present and appreciating the here and now. But it doesn't stop there. Our relationships can also take a hit. When we're always worried, we're not fully present with the people we care about. We might be physically there, but mentally we're elsewhere, tangled up in our web of worries. This can lead to a disconnection from our loved ones, straining relationships and making us feel even more isolated and anxious. Performance is another area where imaginary suffering takes its toll. Whether it's at work, school, or in our personal pursuits, the fear of potential negative outcomes can hinder our ability to perform at our best. It's hard to focus on the task at hand when our minds are preoccupied with what-ifs. Over time, this can lead to decreased productivity, missed opportunities, and a lack of fulfillment in our accomplishments. But the implications of imaginary suffering go beyond the personal level. It seeps into the fabric of our societies, creating a ripple effect of widespread stress and anxiety. Consider the workplace. When employees are constantly worried about potential problems or negative outcomes, it can create a high-stress environment that's detrimental to both individual well-being and overall productivity. This in turn can lead to increased absenteeism, higher turnover rates, and lower job satisfaction. Similarly, social anxiety, a form of imaginary suffering where people overly worry about social interactions, can lead to social isolation and loneliness on a societal scale. This can exacerbate mental health issues, hinder community building, and even have economic consequences. There's also the impact on our healthcare systems. Many people suffer from what's known as health anxiety, where they excessively worry about having a serious illness despite having no or only mild symptoms. This can lead to unnecessary medical appointments and tests, putting additional strain on already overburdened healthcare systems. Clearly, imaginary suffering has real consequences, but fear not. Stoicism offers a way out. Through understanding and applying Stoic principles, we can learn to control our internal reactions, focus on what's within our control, and ultimately reduce the unnecessary suffering caused by our own imaginations. So, let's delve into these Stoic strategies and start our journey towards mastering the mind. Now that we understand the problem, let's explore Stoic solutions. The first step in overcoming imaginary suffering is to become aware of our thought patterns. The Stoics emphasize mindfulness, the practice of being fully present and engaged in the here and now. When we are mindful, we can observe our thoughts and emotions without judgment. We can notice when our thoughts start to drift towards worst-case scenarios and gently guide them back to reality. This awareness allows us to challenge our irrational worries. Ask yourself, is this thought based on fact or fear? Most of the time, you'll find it's the latter. The Stoics taught that we should focus only on what is within our control. We can't control the future, but we can control our thoughts about the future. Next, let's talk about cognitive reframing. This is a psychological technique that involves identifying negative thoughts and challenging their accuracy. Once we've identified a negative thought, we can reframe it in a more positive or realistic way. For example, instead of thinking I'm going to mess up this presentation and everyone will laugh at me, we could reframe it as I've prepared well for this presentation, and even if I make a mistake, it's a chance to show my resilience and ability to improvise. Now, it's not enough to understand these techniques intellectually. We need to put them into practice. The Stoics were big believers in the power of practical exercises. One simple exercise is journaling reflections on your fears versus the actual outcomes. At the end of each day, write down what you were worried about and what actually happened. Over time, you'll likely see a pattern. Your worries rarely come to fruition. This can help to reinforce the idea that much of our suffering is indeed imaginary. Another useful exercise is daily meditation focusing on your present feelings. Instead of letting your mind wander into the future, try to stay grounded in the here and now. What can you see, hear, smell, touch, taste? How does your body feel? By focusing on the present, you can help to reduce anxiety about the future. Lastly, it's important to remember that change doesn't happen overnight. Overcoming imaginary suffering is a journey, not a destination, but with persistence and practice, you can learn to manage your worries and reduce your suffering. Remember, as Seneca said, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. By becoming more aware of our thought patterns, challenging our irrational worries and practicing cognitive reframing, we can start to shift our perspective. We can learn to focus on what is within our control and let go of the rest. With these strategies, we can start to regain control over our minds and reduce our imaginary suffering. But how can we implement these strategies in our day-to-day lives? To begin, it's important to build a routine. Start your day with setting realistic expectations. Don't envision the day as a battlefield littered with worst-case scenarios. Instead, see it as an opportunity to observe, learn and grow from whatever comes your way. Next, practice mindfulness throughout the day. Pay attention to your thoughts. Are you catastrophizing a minor setback or obsessing over something out of your control? If so, pause. Take a deep breath. Remind yourself of Seneca's wisdom: we suffer more in imagination than in reality. At the end of the day, reflect on the actual outcomes versus your feared ones. Did your worries materialize, or were they merely phantoms of your mind? Write your reflections in a journal. Over time, you'll see a pattern. Our minds often predict disasters that never come to pass. Now let's talk about long-term practices. Engage with Stoic philosophy on a regular basis. Read Stoic texts, join Stoic communities, participate in discussions. The more you immerse yourself in Stoicism, the more natural its principles will become. Another powerful practice is regular self-review. Take some time each week to assess how well you're applying Stoic principles. Are you managing your anticipatory anxiety? Are you focusing on what's within your control? Use these insights to continually refine your approach. Remember, Stoicism is not about suppressing emotions. It's about understanding them, managing them, and using them as tools for personal growth. It's about realizing that while we can't control every event in our lives, we can control how we respond. And in that response lies our power and our freedom. With these practices, we can make Stoicism not just a philosophy, but a lifestyle. So we've taken quite a journey today. From understanding our imaginary suffering to learning how Stoicism can help us combat it. We've delved into the wisdom of Seneca, unraveled the concept of suffering more in imagination than in reality, and explored the psychology behind our tendency to anticipate the worst. We've seen the impact of this anticipatory anxiety on our personal lives and society at large, and we've discovered Stoic strategies to challenge and reframe our thoughts. We've even touched on ways to weave this wisdom into our everyday routines, transforming our fears into tools for growth and resilience. By incorporating these principles, we can begin to master our minds, turning our worries into wisdom. Remember, the power to transform worry into wisdom lies within you. We encourage you to start applying these principles and share your experiences and progress.